Welcome to the B Block Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Scott. I appreciate you for being here with me. A couple of days ago, I was on here talking about the Texans' first few draft picks. They did not pick until day 2. We talked about those picks: cornerback Kamari Lassiter, offensive tackle Blake Fisher, and safety Kalen Bullock. Since we talked, they have picked, six players? 6 players, 5 in the last 2 rounds, and I want to take some time to discuss these players, or at least my overall takeaways from the draft. We also got some more Texans news and some more Astros news to touch on briefly at the end of the podcast, but here's where I want to start. Overall, okay, and if you guys haven't caught it, I'm sure you have at this point. The draft ended a couple of days ago. The Texans finished up with Cade Stover as their 4th round pick, and we'll talk about Cade in just a minute. Cade Stover, the tight end out of Ohio State, a former teammate of C.J. Stroud, is their 4th round pick. They don't pick in the 5th round, but then they pick 5 players in the last 2 rounds, in the 6th and 7th round. And so I want to touch on how this whole thing played out, or at least how I think it's going to play out with their draft picks. But before we do that, just go over it. Cade Stover, the 4th round pick. The 6th round picks are linebacker Jamal Hill out of Oregon, running back Jahar Jordan out of Louisville. And then in the 7th round, they pick edge rusher Solomon Byrd out of USC, defensive tackle Marcus Harris out of Auburn, and offensive lineman Ladarius Henderson also in the 7th round. So that's 3 7th rounders there. Ladarius Henderson, the last pick that they had, the left tackle for the national championship Michigan team. So these are solid picks. I ended up, and I mentioned this in the last podcast that we did, that I was going to do grades, that I would have Texans draft grades for Cron.com, and I did those. And my overall grade for the Texans was a B. And we don't have to go through all of those grades right here on the podcast, but the overall grade for them was a B. And the big takeaway from all of it is that I feel like they've got 3 draft picks that can come in and help immediately. I know there's been a lot of conversation about how much better did they get? Are the Texans a better football team after the draft? I think that they are. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think they have in this draft 3 players who can help them immediately, either as starters or reserves. There are 3 players that I think that can help them immediately at their positions, not just playing on special teams. Any or all of these guys could be contributors on special teams and could be really good special teams players. But specifically at the positions they were drafted at, I think they've got 3 guys who can come in and help them immediately, either as starters or reserves. And if not immediately, they are at the most a developmental project, maybe for a year, or a reserve for a year before you sort of hand over the reins to them. And those 3 players are really 3 that we've already mentioned. Cade Stover, the 4th round pick, I think that is clearly going to be somebody that they feel like they can utilize. He's got a chance, I think, to be a real playmaker for the Texans, already having that chemistry and that relationship with C.J. Stroud, which I think does matter. I think that is – I don't think it's insignificant. I think it's part of what – clearly, to me, part of what drew the Texans to Cade Stover, aside from him being a really good football player. Stroud was there when Cade Stover was going back and forth between linebacker and tight end. He's played a number of positions and is really still just learning the tight end position. but the dude, at least to me, looks like a legitimate receiving threat. And I think that CJ Stroud views him that way as well. To me, it'll be interesting to see what formations look like with the tight ends that they have, because the one interesting trend of sort of tight end, or the tight ends that they've invested in or utilized in these last couple of years, whether it be signing Dalton Schultz and then re-signing Dalton Schultz, and now drafting Cade Stover, and of course Brevin Jordan was able to make some contributions to the team last season. But the theme here is that they want tight ends who are receiving threats, who are dynamic in some kind of capacity in the offense, particularly in the passing game, and they will settle for, maybe settle's not the appropriate word, but they will deal with tight ends who are at the very least willing to block, even if they are not the best blockers. And I think that that's what they have here in this collection of tight ends between Dalton Schultz, Brevin Jordan, and now Cade Stover, all guys who I think can be dynamic in the passing game. And while they may not be critically acclaimed blockers, they may not be like just the known for their blocking ability, they are all at least willing to do it, at least willing to put themselves out there. Blocking is more about an attitude. And in Dalton Schultz's case, he's dynamic enough a pass catcher to where it almost doesn't really matter as much. But all of them, I feel like, have at least shown a willingness, if not the greatest ability, to block out there. And so blocking is going to be more about attitude and willingness. Like, to me, that's half the battle. And if you've got tight ends that are at least willing, you'll take that if they can provide something dynamic for you in the passing game. So I think Cade Stover is an obvious future contributor to this team. And if you don't believe me, if you don't believe what I'm saying about Cade Stover and this whole idea that he is their favorite drafted player here, Nick Caserio used the term elite in the first sentence in describing or talking about Cade Stover when he was asked about him. Listen to that right here.
Yeah, whatever it is, it's elite. I mean, this guy is as tough and hard-nosed a player that they had in the program. Just kind of going back to the question and D'Amico's answer about developing players, I'd say Cade's a good example of a player who's only played tight end for 2 years, so he's certainly not a finished product, but he has the mindset and the work ethic to improve. I mean, how he was raised. I mean, this guy is everything you want in a football player, and then more. I mean, he probably played hurt this year. I mean, I think he had an MCL or had an issue where, quite frankly, it would have limited some other players, but he just braced it up, and he just kept playing football. So, I mean, I don't want to speak for D'Amico, but I think we feel the same way. This is probably one of our favorite, football players in the entire draft, regardless of position, because of his mentality, because of his mindset. And he still is developing as a player. I mean, 2 years ago, he was playing defensive end in the Rose Bowl against Utah. Now he's, played tight end for 2 years, and here he is getting picked in the bottom of the fourth round, and his position is, we think tight end. That's why we drafted him. So, but I mean, blue collar as they come, and from a makeup, traits, toughness, mentality. I mean, this is an elite guy. Yeah.
He called him elite. He says this is an elite guy, one of our favorite players in the entire draft, regardless of position. Everything you want in a football player and more. Touts him for playing through injury, gives the utmost respect for this guy's toughness. I've got a tough time thinking or believing that Cade Stover, between his relationship with CJ Stroud and the fondness that Nick and affection that the general manager who selected him showed in that press conference, in that clip that we just played, in the sound that you heard, I've got a tough time believing that guy is not going to be a significant contributor and somebody that they lean on, that they try to find ways to utilize and tap into his untapped potential. I heard Seth Payne talking quite a bit on Monday morning about doing a little bit more digging on the blocking and why it doesn't necessarily look as great as you want it to. It's got a lot to do with him still learning the position. It has nothing to do with say physical ability, toughness, or willingness. And if you have those things, again, that is an initial starting point. So you hear Nick Caserio talk about Cade Stover and how much he likes him. Obviously, CJ Stroud and Stover have a relationship, having played together at Ohio State. So it is again just hard to imagine him not mattering. And then the other two draft picks that I think could contribute immediately, either as starters or reserves, just outright contributors to the team at their actual positions, not just on special teams. Kamari Lassiter and Kalen Bullock, the corner and the safety that they drafted on day one, on day two. And I talked about them already a little bit in the last episode, but these are really two guys that I think, and the more that I've thought about it, I think can really come on and contribute to the team, even if they don't go out there and say win a starting spot. I feel like I talked a little bit about that earlier of like, or in the last episode of just like, hey, here's this guy's chance. Here's Lassiter's chance to perhaps be the slot corner of the future. Or, hey, the guys on the outside opposite of Derek Stingley, Jeff Okudah, and CJ Henderson are not guaranteed to be starters for you, or at least should be in a position where they're having to prove themselves and compete for their positions. There's no reason why a second round pick shouldn't be able, with Lassiter's pedigree at that, shouldn't be able to go out there and compete with those guys. And so all of that I think is still true, but I think that at the very least he'll be able to develop for a year if he needs to, and so I like that. But aside from that, if he's not your starting outside corner or your starting slot corner, I could see him out there in, as a backup to Desmond King in some nickel packages, or as a fourth corner in dime packages. That I think that's the part that I'm most intrigued by. The more I think about both Lassiter and Bullock, okay, because Bullock, I think could see some time at safety. Because think about this. I mean, who do you have the most confidence in between Jimmy Ward and Jalen Petrie? Maybe you have confidence in both. And they have both shown themselves to be solid players for a period of time. Jalen Petrie, at least for his rookie year, and Jimmy Ward throughout his career. But all of this, I think, is dependent on what you get from Jimmy Ward, who is an aging player who has dealt with injuries over the past couple of seasons. And then you've got Jalen Petrie, who is still young, but let's be honest, was not great in year one of the D'Amico Ryans era. That's not to write him off. That's not to say that he's not going to be a very good player. But Bullock is coming into a situation where the position group that he's a part of is not considered the same level of position of strength that it was a season ago. And he's faster than the corner that they just drafted, the one that they just drafted way ahead of him. And D'Amico Ryans was, if you saw the video, was ecstatic about getting him. So with Bullock and Kamari Lassiter, I feel like I'm just doing, and this could just be a fantasy thing of like just trying to imagine how they could contribute. But couldn't you see them in dime packages where you bring in a fourth cornerback and the two safeties that you put out there are your best coverage safeties? And I could see that maybe immediately, given some of the struggles that we've seen Petrie have in coverage, and then just the age and injury and wear and tear on Jimmy Ward. I could see Bullock being maybe the best safety option in a dime package, and then you just decide between Ward and Petrie which one is better for you in that scenario. Maybe you want Petrie out there as just, I guess, depending on how you line it up exactly. But dime packages where there are four cornerbacks and you want your best coverage guys out there, I could very much see Bullock out there contributing. Very much see it. So I'm excited about what they did, and excited is probably not the right word. That's not the right word at all. I'm over. Let me check myself. I got a little ahead of myself there and said excited. I am intrigued. I'm excited about the team overall. I'm excited about what they already did leading up to the draft. The draft itself brings about some excitement. It is in and of itself exciting. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I feel like they drafted a superstar like they did last year when they drafted two. Okay. I'm not going to pretend like I feel that way, but I do feel like they drafted a handful of guys who can and honestly should make some contributions to the team. So those are the three draft picks that I think could help the Texans immediately. I mentioned Kay Stover, who is clearly their favorite draft pick. Nick Caserio talked about how much they like. He said he's one of their favorite players in the entire draft, regardless of position. You tell me how you think they're going to prioritize that guy. And he's already got a relationship with the franchise quarterback. You tell me how you think they're going to prioritize a guy like that, a guy that they speak that highly of before he even touches the field. So those guys are exciting to me. Cade Stover, clearly their favorite draft pick. Kamari Lassiter, their first draft pick, and an accomplished player at Georgia, a two-time national champion at Georgia. The guy's played a lot of football, a lot of winning football. You got to believe. I know that the conversation about his speed is out there, and Nick Caserio downplayed it. And look, you got to believe that if the speed is an issue on the outside, that he does have enough skill and football instinct and nastiness to him to play on the inside. And I'm not yet sold on or convinced on him not necessarily being an outside corner. We'll just have to see how that whole thing plays out. But as reserves, I could see Cade Stover as their favorite pick, being somebody that they incorporate quite a bit in the offense. Kamari Lassiter is going to have a chance to compete for a starting position because really all three of these guys that I'm talking about, between Stover, Lassiter, and Bullock, it's just as much about the state of their position on the team, their position group on the team, as it is about them. I think it's both. All three of them are well thought of, well regarded prospects. And at all three of their position groups, they could either use some help or upgrades. So those are the three that I'm looking out for the most. We didn't. So the Blake Fisher. Before I get to the final five players that were picked in the last two rounds, or to the five players that were picked in the final two rounds, the Blake Fisher thing, we talked about that in the last episode as well. I am intrigued, man. I can't lie to you guys. I am intrigued because I'm one of the folks that actually believes in the tackles that they have. I think Laramie Tunsil is a damn good left tackle, and I think Titus Howard, when they actually leave him there at right tackle, is a damn good right tackle. I don't know about Nick Caserio's comment saying he's one of the best in the league. I don't know if he's one of the best in the league or not, honestly. I don't know how much his contract is actually representative of how good he is. But I do think that he's a good right tackle. You can say that they shouldn't have given him the contract. You can have the opinion that he's overpaid, whatever you want to say. You're not going to be able to convince me that Titus Howard can't all of a sudden can't play right tackle. What happened is they didn't have a left guard. Their left guard that they drafted couldn't play left guard because he was injured, whatever the case may be. And they didn't have enough left guards. They had to play him there. And then they looked up and his replacement was just fine while there was nobody there to play left guard. There is a sentiment, a belief, a narrative out there that all of a sudden, just because Titus Howard has been grossly mismanaged, that somehow he is not a good football player. And I'm not his agent, his relative, or his publicist or anything like that. But I find that narrative to be ridiculous. Titus Howard has not gone out there and shown us that he is not a good right tackle. The Texans have gone out there and, in my opinion, mismanaged Titus Howard. At the very least, mismanaged like his image and the outlook on him, because now people think that the dude can't play football at all because they had him playing the wrong damn position. And then they go and draft what looks like it could be his replacement. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Titus Howard isn't as good as I thought. Maybe they did make a mistake, and maybe the Blake Fisher selection is indicative of that. Maybe this is a sign of how they feel and the direction that they're headed at the tackle position. And I talked about this. It felt like them hedging on the tackles, but I still have a tough time imagining Blake Fisher contributing over the next couple of years. And if he does, that means that something really bad happened with them tackles. So maybe you can throw him in there. I got 3 Texans draft picks who can help immediately, and maybe he's a fourth that I'm not expecting. I do like him as a football player. If there was a greater sense of urgency, at least on my part, for the Texans at tackle, that one would make a lot of sense. I'm not knocking Blake Fisher as a football player or even as a draft pick. I am just simply stating that I am confused or somewhat confused and curious about what the Texans think about their tackles, the ones that they've paid recently. Because I have just never bought into the idea that these guys can't play, specifically Titus Howard, that he needs a replacement. So that's interesting to me. I did not include him in the 3 because I do not expect him to play if health is not a factor. Now, if one of those guys goes down, and Blake Fisher is the player that they think he is a second round pick. If he's the player that they think he is and that I think he is and hope he is, then thank God they drafted him if one of these guys goes down. And to be fair, these guys have gone down in recent years. We've seen Laramie Tunsil go down. We've seen Titus Howard go down. So it's either hedging or it's insurance. Just like I said in the last episode, right? It's either hedging or it's insurance. But it is, to me, curious to draft a tackle that high. I hope that it all works out for the best. But it was easily the most curious pick for me, even if it was a sensible. I mean, maybe it was Seth that mentioned this as well. Like maybe that was best player available situation. And I am a proponent of best player available. I am a proponent of that in the draft, of just drafting the best player available. The odds that every time that you draft the best player available, the guy's going to be at the same position to me are low. If you draft the best player available every time, eventually you'll have a collection of players. And then supplement that with your other team building exercises like free agency and the draft. Almost always draft the best player available with need in mind. With need in mind. So it should be like a power ranking of priority to me of best player available first, and then say, okay, how much do I need this player? That honestly to me was the Michael Penix. Not to get on a sidetrack here, but that to me was the Michael Penix pick. Was honestly as absurd as it seemed, given how much money the Atlanta Falcons have just paid or guaranteed to pay Kirk Cousins. I looked after that and thought that you could have made a case at least that Michael Penix was the best player available at 8. And that could be just me being a little bit higher on Michael Penix than a lot of people are. But I like him as a player. I think he could be their answer at quarterback in the future. I do. I'm not bothered by the idea of him getting his second contract at 28 or 29. That should be the prime of his career. What's that, a 3 or 4 year deal? Maybe he's cooked after that. But, I mean, to me, you got a quarterback on a rookie deal. It kind of wasted it seems like, since you're paying Kirk Cousins. But then he should still be at an age on his first, or I should say second first contract extension, to still be able to perform for you. So to me, now they did. What calculation did the Falcons do on how much they needed a quarterback? Clearly, they feel like they needed one more than the rest of us did after they paid $100 million for one. But that, to me, should always be the calculation. Best player available with position of need in mind. And clearly, with this Fisher pick by the Texans, they felt like they needed a tackle more than a lot of us did. And I have seen a lot of y'all in the Sports Radio 610 chats and elsewhere on social media in support of this move, because you do lack faith in the tackle pairing that they have. I do realize that not everybody feels as confident about these guys as I do. So and it feels like the team itself is supporting that. So we'll see how that plays out. These last 5 players that they selected, the last 5 players that the Texans selected, I am not necessarily expecting a whole lot out of. And I feel like that's reasonable. I hope that everybody thinks that that's reasonable, but I'm not expecting a whole lot out of 5 players selected in the last 2 rounds. Okay. Now, of them, I'll say that, well, so I'll say that all of them intrigue me in some kind of way, even though the likelihood of any of them really being significant contributors to the team is pretty low. But all of them intrigue me in a different way. I'm fine if none of them ever contribute to the team, if at least 3 of those top 4 hit. I am. I'm just going to say that off top. I am actually fine if the last 5 players that they picked, if none of them ever contribute to the team in a significant way, as long as at least 3 of those top 4 hit between Lassiter, Fisher, Bullock, and Cade Stover. I think between those 4, you should have 3 players that contribute to your team at some point, if not all 4 of them. Honestly, those second round picks, you would expect them to definitely contribute. And I like a lot the 3rd round and 4th round pick in Bullock and Stover. So if three of the 4 of those guys contribute, I'll be fine if we never really hear much from these last 5 players. All 5 of them, I think this is interesting. All 5 of them are 5-year or more players, much different from the first 3 players that the Texans took in this draft. I mentioned in that last episode how all of those guys were around 20, were either just turned 21 years old or are about to turn 21, like literally tomorrow. One of those guys is going to turn 21 tomorrow. So that's how young and untapped I feel like those guys are. Cade Stover, I think, is also a 5-year guy, but did all of that position switching. And so to me, he's kind of a young player, even though he's not that young in age, because he's only played his position for a couple of years. And that's really the same case with the linebacker Jamal Hill that they drafted out of Oregon. Jamal Hill is the linebacker that they drafted in the 6th round out of Oregon, and he is intriguing to me really because of his speed. And I would say I'm starting with him because I would say he's the most intriguing of them all to me. Not that I think he's most likely to contribute or that he's the best player or any of that. I'm saying he's the most intriguing of them all to me because of his speed at linebacker, and really because he's like an oversized safety and an undersized linebacker, a converted safety, played safety for the most part during his time at Oregon until they converted him to linebacker recently. And to me, he represents this era of linebacker that, whereas it used to be the linebacker was more tackle first and then cover, now your linebackers out there, just to survive, they have to be able to cover. Like, you cannot afford to have linebackers out there who can't cover. The popularization of the play action game and just the how often the frequency in which teams pass the ball, you cannot be having linebackers out there that can't cover. You obviously can't have really anybody out there who can't tackle, which I know is the kind of the knock on the safety Bullet, but his calling card is going to be deep safety, maybe some slot corner. We'll see how they utilize him, but his calling card is going to be coverage. But you can't have linebackers out there who can't cover for the most part. So he represents that new era of linebacker to me, the ones that can cover and tackle. He was, as a safety, a sure tackler, and as a linebacker was a sure tackler in the short time in which they converted him. So He's undersized, 6 foot, around 220 pounds, but he's basically the same size as Quincy Williams, the linebacker for the New York Jets. Quentin Williams' brother, first team All Pro linebackers, basically the same size. I think he might even be a little bit bigger than Quincy Williams. So it shows you that guys that size can get it done at that position in this league in today's era, in today's NFL. So given his physical skills, his physical traits, I am most intrigued by him. I talked earlier with Bullock about dime packages and what those could look like. Like I'm probably getting ahead of myself here because they haven't even taken the field or the practice field or anything like that. The Texans themselves might not even know exactly what they got in all of these guys. But Jamal Hill is another one of those who, hell, if he can be an every down type of linebacker, then all the more, all the power to him. But, right now you're expecting your top guys to be Azeez Al-Shaair and Christian Harris, obviously. And those guys will be in basically all of the packages that they run. And then that third linebacker, I think we'll see. Like that's a need for them. And again, we'll see. That's a need for them. And being a sort of a coverage linebacker is a strength of his. So if he can come in there and establish himself and that speed that he has translate, I think he might even be faster than the quarterback that they drafted, which would be encouraging on one end and concerning on the other. You want your linebackers to be fast, but you also want your corners to be fast and certainly not slower than your linebackers, even if the general manager tells you that speed doesn't minimize how much speed matters, but minimizes how much speed is an issue with Lassiter with the top pick. So I am most intrigued by Jamal Hill, the linebacker out of Oregon, because of his speed, his background as a safety, and the fact that in today's game you need linebackers who can cover, and honestly linebackers who can chase down more athletic quarterbacks that are more athletic than yesteryear. So again, not expecting fine if it doesn't work out the way that I just described, but am intrigued by it. Jawar Jordan, the running back, I think he has the best chance to be an impact player of the last 5 picks that they picked. Jawar Jordan, he is a running back out of Louisville, and they picked him, also in the 6th round. So that's their second 6th round pick, Jawar Jordan. He actually reminds me a little bit of Devin Singletary. I don't think he's quite as quick or as twitchy as Devin Singletary, but he's sort of built in that vein. A tough guy who is a smaller, tough guy who is willing to mix it up in the passing game, in the trenches as well, but also has great vision. His jump cut is really good. I don't want to say he's the anti-Dameon Pierce because that feels very disrespectful to Dameon Pierce for no reason. But you know how Dameon Pierce's issue was seeing the rush lanes and understanding the rhythm of the zone blocking scheme. I don't watch Jawar Jordan and feel like he's going to have that issue. I've got questions about how explosive he really is and how dynamic of a running back he really is, but I don't have no questions about how tough he is. That shows up on tape. And I don't have any questions about whether he knows what he's doing out there. I feel like that's a guy that has a very good chance to take over as the second back behind Joe Mixon if Dameon Pierce does not take a step, does not progress from what we saw last year and how he was processing this new offense, this offense that is not going to be new anymore with him in his second year in it. And Jordan seems to already have some attributes, some skills about him already that seems to be conducive toward what the Texans have going on. Would not be shocked, nor would I be disappointed if he never contributes to the team. But I do think of all of these guys, he's the one with the best chance to be an impact player, again, because of his position group and because of the way he shows up on tape. I think that there is absolutely something there. Almost had a little interruption here. I think I handled that just fine. This shows that I'm actually doing this way too late when the cleaning crew comes into the studio and almost vacuums through my episode. That means I need to get through the rest of this thing. Marcus Harris, the defensive tackle out of Auburn. I would say that he's next on my list after Jordan in terms of likelihood of being productive or being a contributor, just because he was productive at Auburn for 3 years. He was a really solid player for them. And I think that that's a position where the Texans could obviously use some depth. I think it's a position that they were focusing on at the higher end of the draft with their first picks. They talked about that, or Caserio at least talked about that. There being some defensive tackles out there that they liked and that they weren't able to add to their team. I truly wonder who those guys are. But given the fact that they couldn't add those guys to their team, Lassiter made sense for them in the position that they were in. And Marcus Harris, absolutely, as a value pick, makes sense for them as well for where they were picking in that position in the seventh round. Now, I skipped over Solomon Byrd because, to me, and I'll get to him last. I think Marcus Harris in the seventh round is one of their better value picks, and somebody who, after Jawar Jordan, I feel like could come out there and contribute. I mean, this guy had 7 sacks and 11 tackles for loss last season for Auburn, and was really productive his entire time. He started his career at Kansas. I mentioned these guys are all 5-6 year guys, COVID era college guys, okay, who took advantage of that extra year. But 7 sacks and 11 tackles for loss in the SEC for Auburn last year, for me, is nothing to sneeze at. And Marcus Harris, to me, is somebody who could find his way into a rotation as a contributor to this team. Now, Ladarius Henderson, this intrigues me. This is their final pick, okay? And I mentioned I'll come back up to Solomon Byrd, but Ladarius Henderson intrigues me because he played left tackle on the national championship team, and the Michigan offensive line was arguably the best in the country, at least one of the best in the country, which bore itself out, proved itself with them in the national championship game. And throughout the season, at times when they were just able to dominate teams up front, he was their left tackle at the end there. You know, the dude has played a lot of left tackle. I know he's listed and thought to be as perhaps a guard, but he's played both. Okay. Played a lot of left tackle, played 10 games at left tackle for Arizona State way back in 2019. And basically, it feels like between Ladarius Henderson being their final pick and Fisher, Blake Fisher being their second round pick, it feels like the Texans offensive line, specifically the tackle, should be on notice. Feels like they should be on notice. Now, maybe Henderson's a guard and it's Kenyon Green who should be on notice because he has played some left guard, right? But it feels like the offensive line, there are offensive linemen on this team who should be on notice because they've got these accomplished, cheaper guys behind them that could honestly push them. Or if they decide that these guys in a year or two, likely to, that these guys are too expensive or the wear and tear is there, whatever the case may be. Because like I mentioned before, they both have experienced injuries between Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard. They could decide in the next year or two that they've got their heir apparent at tackle between Fisher and Henderson. And I say that because both of them, again, have played a lot of meaningful football. In Fisher's case, he's a younger player with untapped potential. In Henderson's case, he is a wildly experienced player who was a part of, a championship team. Now, Austin Deculus was a tackle for the national championship LSU team, if I'm not mistaken. And that didn't necessarily turn into, one of the tackles of the future per se. So I temper or qualify at least the comments with that. But it is intriguing to say the least. Solomon Byrd, I mentioned the edge rusher from USC. He seems like a guy who could just be on rosters for a long time in the league without ever making a huge mark in the league. Like maybe not a high impact player necessarily, but one that hangs around for a long time. signing with a different team every year or every other year. Like he's got that toughness about him, even though there's nothing really about him physically that I would say stands out. He would probably be the most surprising of me, or most surprising to me, to stand out among this group. I would say that he is. I would say that he is a rotational piece at best, and probably not much beyond that. But look, Solomon Byrd is a defensive lineman name. Solomon Byrd feels like a defensive lineman, defensive end, tough guy kind of name, like ass kicker. Like don't mess with Solomon Byrd is what if I don't. And I don't know Solomon Byrd from Adam. I was not on the Zoom call to chat it up with him or anything like that, but I can see somebody with a name like Solomon Byrd just hanging around, even if it's not always playing at the highest level. I could see Solomon Byrd being like the ultimate depth piece for like eternity, for like the ultimate amount of time. It's just got that feel to it. But in terms of guys that I'm just really expecting to be contributors that I'm excited about, man, it is the three players that I mentioned earlier: Lassiter, Stover, and Bullock. Those are the ones that I'll be watching the most at rookie camp, at training camp. I'll be watching all of them, but those are the ones that I'll be intrigued the most by. And then a close fourth is going to be Jamal Hill. The thing with Fisher is just going to be like kind of put a pin in that, because as long as Titus Howard and Laramie Tunsil are healthy, they should be playing tackle. Now, if they get hurt, now we're having a different conversation. But absent of that, those other three that I mentioned, Bullock, Stover, and Lassiter, and then a close fourth, you're right behind them is going to be Jamal Hill, Jahar Jordan, and Marcus Harris. I think they've got chances to be a part of, not superstars, not guys that are out there necessarily modeling the jerseys and putting their jerseys on the mannequins and, you know, putting them on billboards and nothing like that. I'm not talking about that, but solid rotational pieces, not just on special teams, but at their positions. I could honestly see it. Now, the last piece of news on the Texans was Tank Dell and the shooting in Florida. Y'all probably have all the information that y'all need on that by now. I did a video for Sports Radio 610, YouTube, and social media pages with the best update that I could provide from the information that was out there. The only thing that it seems like I got wrong about it was the characterization of the venue being a nightclub. I've been checked on that. Apparently, it was not a nightclub. It was a private event at something like a marina or event space or something like that. But it was not a nightclub. I think it matters to point that out, just because we want to be factual. We don't want to be loose with facts. So I think that that's always important. But functionally, I feel like this was kind of the same thing. I feel like this was kind of the same vibe. And I would point out as well that I did make a point to not vilify the nightclub experience as something like, hey, you don't need to be doing this and all of that. Like I felt like my overall point was, at the time, I thought it was a nightclub. Have learned since that it wasn't. But even if it was, my man should be able to go out to a nightclub and not worry about getting shot. And I know a lot of people will just say, hey, man, that's not the reality. But the reality is also that Tank Dell, I'm pretty sure, was not the only damn professional athlete who went out on Saturday night and was up and out until the early morning hours Sunday morning. I'm sure he was not the only one. Yet he's the only one who was in the news for getting shot. So that just speaks to how unlucky of a situation he found himself in. And yeah, you do want to be careful about the places that you go and the people that you're around. That's pretty obvious. But I think the big story and the big point, aside from this like silly commentary about going to clubs and trying to police what a 24, 20, however old Tank is at this point, a dude in his early to mid 20s, policing his lawful behavior, is to me unnecessary. And the big takeaway is just to be thankful that the man is expected to be okay. The wound, I mentioned that I'm very hesitant to call a wound minor. when it's not, when it's somebody else's. Easy for me to say it's a minor wound. I ain't the one that got shot. Right? Easy for y'all to call it minor. Y'all ain't the ones that got shot. Hell, it's easy enough for the medical professionals to call it minor because they ain't the ones that got shot. But the point is, man was involved, was one of 10 victims, I should say, was one of 10 shooting victims at this spot in Florida, Sanford, Florida, by the way. And Sanford, Florida should sound familiar. Even if you're not from Florida, Sanford, Florida should stand out to you if you kept up with the news over the last 12, 13 years or so. But anyway, that's what went down. Argument ensued. Juvenile suspect pulls out a gun and starts shooting into a crowd of people. 10 people get shot, and miraculously, nobody suffers a life-threatening injury. 10 people get touched, and nobody dies, and nobody suffers a life-threatening injury. I need folks to focus more on the miraculous nature of that and how great of a fact that is. How horrible it is that that would happen to begin with, but how great of an outcome considering the horrible act, the horrible initial act, how great of an outcome that is, that 10 people could get touched. One of them being Tank Dell, but all of them being actual human lives, and nobody suffer a life-threatening injury. A miracle that I am happy to report and happy to say that it went down that way. Because obviously, when we're talking about gunplay here, gunfire, okay, and we're talking about a teenage suspect shooting into a crowd, dude, that could have ended up so much worse. So tragic. And we just saw Tank just last week, not even a week ago, at the 713 Music Hall, rocking the new Texans gear, modeling the new Texans uniforms. Just saw him. So very glad to hear that he's okay. Very much excited about what he could bring to the team coming off of that injury, based off of what he was bringing to the team before the injury. And more importantly, just, thankful for the young man's life, which means, therefore, okay, assuming that this is not a major wound of any kind that's going to impact him on the field, and I am assuming that for now because I haven't gotten any information to the contrary, but life first, and then very much excited about him putting this behind him and getting back out there on the football field and doing Tank Dell things, which, by the way, does not include blocking at the goal line on obvious run plays. I want to point that out. Because I feel like that's important. Does not include blocking on run plays in obvious running situations. Let's not do that anymore, okay? Thank God for Tank Dell's health and wealth, health and strength. Now let's move on and play some football. Speaking of moving on, last thing I want to mention before I get out of here is Joey Loperfido being called up by the Astros. We have not talked a lot about the Astros on this podcast lately, even though when I came back and decided that I was going to commit to really doing the podcast regularly, and this is a little bit behind the scenes for y'all, but I did want to do a lot of Astros. I wanted this show to be Astros heavy. Hell, I thought that the Astros were going to be such good content that maybe I could even do this podcast more often, right? And maybe even get close to daily if they are interesting enough. And then, damn it, they came out there as one of the bottom 4 or 5 teams in all of baseball, is how they've been through the first 25, however many games it's been or so. Now, they handled business over the weekend in Mexico City against the Colorado Rockies, one of the few teams, by the way, in baseball that is worse than the Astros, that does have a worse record than the Astros. So go figure, they get a good right series in Mexico City against a team that is a non-factor. Don't exactly see that as a reason to be encouraged about where they are right now. But the calling up of Joey Loperfido, the outfielder slash first baseman, is worth noting because, well, you probably have noticed, but the Astros have a little bit of a hole at first base. They've got a little bit of a first base problem, and they have ever since they signed Jose Abreu in the offseason of last year. Now, Jose Abreu was awful to start last season as well, but he came along, was a contributor late in the season, and it felt like, hey, all is well. All is well because, older player, maybe a slow starter, but a guy you can trust to perform late in the season. And I felt like that ended up ringing true. But then you look up and dude, he has just been god awful this year. I mean, it's borderline. Like he's just not a major league player. Okay, he's straight up not a major league player. And if you look up right now, the Astros have the worst F WAR, which essentially measures the value at the position. It wins above replacement. It essentially measures value in baseball, if you don't know that already. They have the lowest WAR according to Fangraphs at the first base position, even worse than the Colorado Rockies, who they just beat. That is not sustainable. That is not sustainable. Jose Abreu is not a good option either offensively or defensively for the Astros. I'm not breaking ground there. The backup to him is John Singleton, a dude who was out of the league, who's out of the majors for an extended period of time and cannot really reasonably be expected to be an everyday contributor for you. Like he should not have to step in for Jose Abreu. So Joey Loperfido gets the call up, 24 years old, hitting the cover off the baseball in Sugarland, in AAA Sugarland, 13 home runs, OPS over 1,100 in the 25 games that he's played for the Space Cowboys so far this season. He's got the lead in home runs across all of the minor leagues. He's the minor league leader in home runs with those 13. And he was really good. He was one of the spring training conversations that I can remember, the guys who were out there and that talk about this ad nauseum, I would say, were really high on him during spring training. He hit 382 and had 5 doubles, a triple, and 7 RBI with an OPS over 1,000 in the 18 spring training games that he played for the Astros. So bring him on. They're calling him up. And he's going to be there for this series that starts on Tuesday against the Cleveland Guardians. The Astros are back at Minute Maid Park. They're trying to get some rhythm going. They won these 2 games in Mexico City against the Colorado Rockies. The Cleveland Guardians are a damn good baseball team. Every time I look up and think, man, that they're not trying because they don't do this or they don't do that in free agency, they just put together like really good baseball teams over the last few years, like surprisingly good baseball teams for the amount of money that they put into their team. So they are no slouch. They are nothing to sneeze at or to sleep on as the Astros host them. So, but I mean, it's just something to monitor. Like, what's it gonna take to get the Astros out of this rut? And here they are, 10 games under 500, playing a team that's 10 games over 500. Here they are with a negative 22 run differential, playing a team with a positive plus 46 run differential. Like the Cleveland Guardians right now are a better baseball team than the Houston Astros in every way. And I don't think some rookie first baseman is going to change that fact. But I do think it could help. I do think it could help, and I do think it can make them less frustrating to watch, which is the hope, which is the prayer, which is the desire. And that's all you can really do at this point when the team is this bad. All right, this already went way longer than I expected it to, which is normally how these episodes go, but I ain't mad at it. This has been the B Block Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Scott. Make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast wherever it is that you get them. Make sure you rate, make sure you review, and you can even tell a friend about it. Until next time, y'all be good.